In September 2023, US President Joe Biden paid a state visit to Vietnam. Invited by the Secretary General of the Communist Party, the most senior Vietnamese political leader, the trip saw the two countries sign a comprehensive strategic partnership. Widely hailed as a historic moment by both governments, it certainly appears to mark an extraordinary turnaround in ties between two countries with a notoriously difficult past and which maintain fundamental ideological differences. So, what exactly lies behind this agreement, and just how deep is this new partnership? Hello and welcome. If you're new to the channel, my name is James Ker-Lindsay, and here I take an informed look at international relations, conflict, security, and statehood. One of the most interesting questions in international relations is how countries build their links after conflict. All too often, a peace agreement will stop the fighting, but it won't end the tensions. Instead, the parties will maintain a frosty relationship for decades afterwards and may even return to war. At other times, an uneasy peace prevails. While the sides normalise their ties, they certainly aren't close. But occasionally, two warring countries will go on to establish a close strategic partnership. One of the best examples in the current international system is the relationship between the United States and Vietnam. Having fought one of the most bitter and brutal wars in modern times, the countries have seemingly forged an increasingly close relationship despite their ongoing ideological differences. But what exactly lies behind all this? The Socialist Republic of Vietnam lies in Southeast Asia. At 330,000 square kilometres or 130,000 square miles, it's the 66th largest country in the world. To its west are Cambodia and Laos, and to its north is China. To its south and east is the South China Sea. This means that regional neighbours include the Philippines, Thailand, Malaysia and Brunei. Its population stands at a little under 100 million. Its GDP per capita stands at around $3,750 a year. This makes it a lower middle income country. Vietnam has a long and fascinating history, emerging around 5,000 years ago when the country established its first monarchy. Over the following centuries, it was increasingly influenced by China, both politically and culturally, before coming under direct Chinese rule. This lasted until 938, when Vietnam became a separate kingdom, albeit maintaining a complex and often conflictual relationship with its northern neighbour. However, everything changed in the 19th century with European colonial expansion into Southeast Asia. Starting in the 1850s, France took control of the southern part of the country. From there, it steadily expanded, and in 1887 it merged its holdings, including present-day Cambodia and Laos, to form the Union of French Indo-China. Under French rule, Vietnam's traditional monarchy was dismantled and the country was heavily exploited. Although roads and other infrastructure were built, this favoured the French elite. At the same time, France increased its cultural influence. As resentment grew, an anti-colonial movement emerged, including a communist party formed in 1925 under the leadership of a young revolutionary, Ho Chi Minh. However, it was the outbreak of the Second World War that would change everything. Having been defeated by Nazi Germany in Europe, France lost control over Vietnam, which became occupied by Imperial Japan. But while Paris sought to reassert its control after Japan's defeat, Ho Chi Minh declared the creation of an independent communist state, the Democratic Republic of Vietnam. This would go on to spark the First Indo-China War. As Vietnamese guerrilla forces from the communist-controlled north, supported by the People's Republic of China and then the Soviet Union, took on the French army, Washington, fearful of a communist takeover in Indochina, threw its support behind France. However, by the early 1950s, France was losing the will to fight. As decolonisation gained pace and after losing a significant battle, it gave up. In July 1954, the sides signed a peace agreement. This divided the country pending national elections. From the start, this partition was rejected by the United States and South Vietnam, which had by now declared independence as the Republic of Vietnam. This would in turn spark the Second Indo-China War, otherwise better known as the Vietnam War. Although Washington initially limited its support to the South, it steadily increased its commitment from the start of the 1960s. And by the second half of the decade, the United States had more than 500,000 personnel on the ground. At the same time, the war was becoming ever more brutal. As the North's insurgency made inroads into the South, the US launched devastating bombing campaigns. This included using chemicals designed to destroy the dense forestry that covered much of the country. Nevertheless, in early 1968, the North launched a major counteroffensive. By 1970, with the South losing the war and growing opposition at home, the US began to draw down its presence and embarked on peace talks. In 1973, the sides reached an agreement. This would see the final withdrawal of all US forces and the peaceful reunification of Vietnam. However, problems soon emerged and the conflict would drag on for several more years. 2 years later, on the 30th of April 1975, as the final US forces made their hasty departure, North Vietnamese troops captured Saigon, the capital of South Vietnam. The country was now united under communist control, becoming the Socialist Republic of Vietnam. The war profoundly affected both Vietnam and the United States, socially, politically, and economically, and would shape their post-war relations for many years afterwards. Apart from the massive loss of life, estimated to be up to 3 million dead, the war left much of Vietnam destroyed. As well as continuing deaths from mines and unexploded bombs, the chemicals used in the country caused long-term damage to the environment and widespread illness and disability. Vietnam therefore linked any normalisation of ties to significant development aid and assistance. Meanwhile, the conflict also scarred the United States. Having lost the war, the first loss in its history, at the cost of almost 60,000 troops, it also faced the issue of over 2,500 personnel listed as either missing in action or held as prisoners of war. As a result, Washington imposed an embargo on Vietnam. As well as hindering reconstruction, this left Vietnam reliant on the Soviet Union, especially after its relations collapsed with Communist China in 1979. But despite the bitter legacy of war, things began to change in the middle of the 1980s. While the Communist Party remained in power, the country now began to open its economy. At the same time, it agreed to assist with the issue of the US personnel missing in action. In return, Washington now allowed non-governmental aid organisations to engage with Vietnam. This process would take off following the collapse of the Soviet Union in 1991, which deprived Vietnam of its crucial ally. With ongoing tensions with Beijing, Vietnam was forced to rethink its orientation. At the same time, attitudes in the United States also changed. As the immediate memories of the Vietnam War faded and it emerged as the sole hyperpower on the world stage, Washington accepted the need for engagement. All this would come to fruition in 1994, following efforts by two senior US senators who'd both served in Vietnam. The United States lifted its embargo, and the following year, the two countries normalised their relations. By the start of the new millennium, things were changing rapidly. In November 2000, Bill Clinton became the first US president to visit Vietnam since the end of the war. This was followed by a visit by Barack Obama in May 2016. Meanwhile, both George W. Bush and Donald Trump also visited the country, albeit to attend multilateral meetings. On top of this, relations continued to strengthen in other ways. Building on the sizable Vietnamese diaspora in the United States, economic ties between the countries rapidly developed. Investment and trade grew, underpinned by agreements signed in 2001 and 2007. On top of this, the two countries established educational and cultural programs and launched initiatives to address environmental damage. But although ties were now seemingly flourishing, critical points of difference nevertheless remained. For example, there were concerns about the massive imbalance in trade. While recent figures show that bilateral trade is now at around $150 billion a year, 80% of this comprises Vietnamese exports to the United States. This has raised questions about market access. Additionally, questions about democracy and human rights also underpin the relationship. Calling the country an authoritarian state with serious corruption, the most recent State Department report highlights problems relating to freedoms of expression, freedom of movement, arbitrary arrest, judicial independence, and cruel and unusual punishment, to name just a few areas of concern. However, as serious as these other issues might be, there's one factor that now drives the relationship: security. Specifically, mutual concern over China's growing regional and international significance. Although Vietnam and China have an extremely long relationship, and China was instrumental in supporting the North during the Vietnam War, their relationship has been strained since the 1970s. After a brief conflict in 1979, the 1980s saw sporadic border skirmishes, and while diplomatic relations were eventually restored in 1991, tensions have continued. Specifically, there's been a steadily escalating dispute over the South China Sea, where China has increasingly asserted its territorial claims. And it's this that's been the key factor that shaped the relationship between Vietnam and the United States over the past decade. As well as driving economic and political ties, it's seen the two countries increase their defence and security cooperation. As well as regular discussions on matters of mutual concern, the US has provided Vietnam with military equipment and training, and the two countries have even engaged in joint military exercises. But just as the strong relationship with the United States is tempered with difficulties, so Vietnam's poor relations with China are also more complex than they may appear. For all the tensions that may exist, China is nevertheless Vietnam's largest trading partner. Likewise, as neighbours ruled by communist parties, they continue to share ideological and political similarities. More to the point, Vietnam has no wish to see a full-scale conflict with China. In this sense, the Vietnam-China relationship is a delicate balance of cooperation and rivalry, shaped by historical, economic, and geopolitical factors. However, China seems to recognise that something has changed following the latest meeting between Biden and the Vietnamese leadership. Beijing appears rattled by how Vietnam and the United States are building their ties. This was apparently highlighted in October 2023, when, just a month after Biden's visit, China's President Xi Jinping issued a seemingly heartfelt appeal for Vietnam to consider all the good times their countries had previously enjoyed. But as tensions continue to escalate in the South China Sea, it seems that Vietnam will continue to move ever closer to the United States. Of course, this isn't the only point of contention over the South China Sea. If you want to know more about what really lies behind this issue, here's another video that you might find helpful. Thanks so much for watching, and see you in the next video.